Silesian architecture is the name given to the constructions made in Silesia throughout time and those by Silesian architects worldwide. The name is also applied to buildings made within its geographical limits before the constitution of Silesia as a duchy or before this name was given to those territories, and largely depends on the historical moment. Due to historic, geographic and generational diversity, Silesian architecture has known a host of influences. Romanesque. The Romanesque art in Silesia appeared with the Christianization of the region. The first known structure, relics of a church on Ostrotumski in Wrocław, was built in the mid-10th century. Around 1000 Bolesław of Poland founded a three-nave cathedral on the same place, styled after the cathedral in Gniezno. Few other buildings of that time are known. The rotunda in Silesian, of Moravian Bohemian origin, dates back to 1050. The 12th century was a time of great advancement. The first monasteries and minsters, in Wrocław and Lubiaz, were built, and the quality of work improved significantly, as the builders adopted architectural styles from southern Germany and Meuse. Outstanding achievements of this era were the cathedral and the abbey church of the Benedictine order in Wrocław, the latter being the most magnificent Romanesque building in Silesia. It was planned after its mother church in Tyniec near Kraków, whereas its westwork was influenced by Thuringian traditions. The church of the first Cistercian monastery in Lubiaz, built by monks from Forta in Thuringia, was the first of many buildings made of brick in Silesia. The beginning of the 13th century was marked by a big increase in building activity, caused by the large influx of German settlers. Most of the municipal churches in Silesia, built of stone or brick, emerged at the time. Examples were Głogów and Nysa, Jelenia Góra Zebis. These late Romanesque Silesian churches were a mix of local, Saxon, Thuringian and Bohemian traditions. Interestingly, there are only 7 known examples of that time in Upper Silesia, but 67 in Lower Silesia, including secular buildings. Gothic. The heralds of Gothic architecture were connected with the building activities of the Cistercians and the patronage of Henry I the Bearded. 2 monasteries, in Trzebnica and in Henrico, as well as 2 residences, in Wrocław and Legnica, were early examples and referred to architectonical standards in southern Germany and along the Rhine. They probably indicate to the dynastic connection between Henry I and the House of Andechs. Characteristic attributes of all these buildings were the combination of brick constructions and details made of stone, which were most likely brought in via Altella in Saxony. The Tatar invasions of 1241 led to the decentralization of Silesia. Baronial patronage decreased, whereas episcopal and later municipal patronage increased. The most important construction project of that time was the Cathedral of Wrocław, which became the first pure Gothic building in Silesia. The Chapel St. Hedwig in Trzebnica was another important structure of that era. Both buildings cited early French traditions, imported via Saxony, Bohemia and Austria. Most Mendicant orders built the monasteries in the second half of the 13th century, most notably in Wrocław, Głogów, Brzeg and Strzelin. At the same time the first hall churches appeared. The most original were in Zebis and Goldberg. Silesia's towns needed approximately 50 years after foundation to get their independence. In the 14th century, many of these towns began to build their own big parish churches, and with the assistance of the new Bohemian sovereign, a dynamic sacral development program began. Dominant were now Bohemian, Moravian, Southern German and Lower Austrian architectural traditions, but mixed with local traditions which preferred more simple forms. The most characteristic creation of the entire 14th century remained the basilical municipal church with a long nave and no transept. This style was most probably derived from the Cistercian abbey in Zlata Koruna in Bohemia. Although Silesia was now a part of Bohemia, a state of the Holy Roman Empire, the parlor Gothic had almost no influence. Architectural embellishments can only be found in 3 churches, probably all built by master builder Klaus Brunner. This dynamic sacral development program lasted the entire 14th century, and starting at around 1370 many bigger cities added guild and family chapels to the parish churches. At the end of the century, all monastery construction projects ended, and with the spreading of the Hussite wars to Silesia most building activities were greatly reduced. The expansion of the town hall in Breslau after 1480 marked a big change in the architectural history of Silesia, as it was obvious that local workshops represented by Hans Berthold could not meet the expectations. The city decided to invite experts from Saxony and Lusatia around master builder Paul Pruss. At the beginning of the new century, this influence from Saxony and Lusatia was most notably in western parts of Silesia, where Konrad Pfluger and Wendell Roscoff from Görlitz built city halls and churches in Löwenberg, Bunzlau, Sagen and Grodixburg, all in the tradition of Benedict Reed from Prague. Later Lucas Schleierweber from Schweidnitz continued this Görlitz style and constructed buildings in other parts of Middle Silesia. Renaissance and Mannerism. The Renaissance era began with the accession of Johann V. Thurzo as Bishop of Breslau. As a great patron of the arts, he introduced the new style in Silesia as he commissioned 2 foundations plates at his residence in Jaunegand, the sacristy portal on the cathedral in Breslau. The latter was probably made by a local artist, whereas most other early Renaissance projects were carried out by Italians from Ticino. The so-called Camasques. The most successful were members of the Parr family, which built the fortifications in Bulkenhain in 1539 and later worked in Brie. The oldest preserved Renaissance buildings today house to the Golden Crown in Breslau and the castle of Charles I, Duke of Munsterberg-Oels in Frankenstein, built after 1524 by Benedict Reed. Many buildings of that time still showed the transition from Gothic to Renaissance. For instance, the castle in Wonwitz of the city halls in Bunzlau, Löwenberg and Grodixburg. Most of these buildings were probably built by Wendell Roscoff, a pupil of Benedict Reed and author of a collection of exceptional Renaissance houses in Görlitz. He probably also was the constructor of Palais Reibisch in Breslau, which was completed by an unnamed Italian artist after 1526. The high building activity in the Middle Ages resulted in cities which were saturated with churches. Only in exceptional cases new churches were planned. For instance, St. Blasius in Ohlau, carried out by Bernhard Nieron in 1587. At the time, most Silesian churches became Protestant and the interest shifted to small alterations of church interiors. A great exception was the conversion of the medieval church in Rothsauben by Hans Schneider, which resulted in one of the best examples of Protestant ecclesiastical architecture in Middle Europe. Much more coherent was the development of secular buildings. The first homogeneous Renaissance building was the Gate of Liegnitz Castle, built 1533 by Georg von Amberg. The highlight of Silesian architecture of that time, however, represented Brieg Castle and his Castle Gate, which is deemed to be the symbol of Silesian Renaissance. It was built between 1544–70 by Franciscus part, the figurative architectural sculptures, the biggest ensemble in Silesia, were carried out by Saxon master Andreas Walther. It depicts George II of Brieg, his wife Barbara von Brandenburg and his line of ancestors. It was most probably modelled after Dresden's Georgenhof, which Parr visited in 1530, and Italian designs. Similar buildings soon followed in Falkenberg, Kreppelhof in Landeshut, Sarau and Plagwitz. Sgraffito appeared first in 1563 in Proskau. Altogether 300 examples are preserved to this day. Stylistically, the early buildings were connected to Bohemian and Lusatian traditions, represented by Wendell Roscoe, Benedict Reed and Hans Lindner, and were still influenced by Gothic ideas. Soon afterwards, the buildings of the Comasques from Italy replaced the work. After 1560, Dutch Renaissance styles, imported by pattern books and master builders like Hans Verdeman de Vries, replaced Italian elements. These Dutch forms were first visible at Ooyel's castle in 1542. Notable representatives of this era were Gaspar Cuneo, Gerhard van Amsterdam and Hans Lucas. Buildings influenced by this style were the castles in Altwarth-Arguismundorf and the majority of the civic architecture of that time. Sporadically, other traditions emerged too. For example, Saxon portals in Liegnitz or Bohemian roofs in Grafenort Castle. The only new development of sacred architecture in Silesia which fully adopted mannerism was the palace chapel of Gemina Siedlisko, commissioned by Valentin von Sabisch. His son Albrecht created the famous Protestant churches of peace, which were constrained by political conditions. Without tower, timber-framed and built in minimal time, they appeared more like commercial construction, a sparse look which was intended. In the simplicity they resembled on Northern European manierism, however they already were a creation of the Baroque era. Baroque. The beginning and the end of the Baroque were marked by two wars, the 30 Years' War and the 7 Years' War. The triumph of the Baroque architecture in Silesia was closely connected to the rise of the House of Habsburg and the Counter-Reformation, whereas its decline was marked by the import of classicism by Prussia, the new owner of Silesia after the 7 Years' War. The religious antagonism of Protestantism and Catholicism led to a sharp contrast of a conservative Protestant Baroque which was in the defense and a vanguard and rousing Catholic Baroque which was in the offensive. The ban to build Protestant churches and the saturation of the region with secular architecture resulted in a decline of building projects. As a consequence, most Baroque palaces of the 17th and 18th century were alterations of existing structures. The destruction of the secular courtly culture by the new Polish owners after 1945 led to a widespread deterioration of palaces in Silesia, and today's remaining palaces and holdovers in museums give only a distorted impression of the Baroque era in Silesia. Important patrons of the Baroque architecture were two bishops from Breslau, Frederick of Hesse-Darmstadt and Franz Ludwig von Pfalz-Neuburg. During the 50-year incumbency, both initiated numerous artistic projects and supported a large array of artists. Cistercian monasteries with their large possession acted as important intellectual and artistic centers, and Cistercian abbots used the arts as an instrument to manifest the prince-like status. They created the conditions for a collaboration of the two workshops of Michael Willmann and Matthias Steinl, which was of pan-European importance. The Jesuits, as the main supporters of the imperial Counter-Reformation, enriched mainly the civic centers with the buildings, much to the aversion of the Protestant society. They were responsible for the spread of basilicas modeled after Il Gesù. Stylistic vocabulary of the Bohemian Dientes and Hofer family and the Baroque theatricalism found, for instance, at Leopoldina University in Breslau. Artistically very active were also the Premonstratensians, Augustinians, Franciscans and the Benedictines, the latter being responsible for the church at whilst at nearly Ignitz, an outstanding architectural monument and one of the most famous symbols of the triumph of the church against non-believers. The privileged higher Catholic nobility, often immigrated at that time, laid the base for large possessions, whereas the Protestant bourgeoisie lost its role as a patron of the architecture and compensated this loss with outstanding achievements in literature, music and science. Characteristic for the Baroque era in Silesia was the glorification of the died-out Silesian Piasts and its successors the Habsburgs. The mother of the last ruling Duke of the Silesian Piasts, Princess Louisa van Halt-Dessau, built a Piast mausoleum in Liegnitz commemorating the extinct dynasty, which shows a unique program by poet Daniel Kasper van Lowenstein. The Cistercians regarded themselves as keepers of the Piastic legacy and erected commemorating programs in Lubus and Grassau, but also rendered homage to the Habsburgs at the University of Breslau, in Lubus and in Lobris. The early period of the Baroque era was marked by the activity of Italian masters, which after the 30 Years' War filled the gaps in the entire Holy Roman Empire. St. Matthias in Breslau and Cistercian churches like Grassau were first altered. Later it affected all churches. The first remodeled palaces were the residences in Zuls, Erowa, Oberglogau, Palais Heberstein in Grafenort by Carlo Lurago and the palace in Proskau by G. Seregni between 1677 to 83. The palace in Sagan, started by Albrecht von Wallenstein and later in possession of the von Lockowitz family, was modelled after Bohemian standards. The Jesuit seminar in Nice was built by Melchior Werner, who represented the first generation of Silesian architects after the war. Important for the Protestant European architecture were the three churches of peace in Glogau, Jauer and Schweidnitz. Its constructor, military engineer Albrecht von Sabisch from Breslau, had to deal with a number of political constraints defined at the Peace of Westphalia. The churches should be built outside of the city walls, without stones and without a tower. The result were churches designed after Dutch and French examples but with local traditions. A second variant of Protestant churches were so-called border churches, simple buildings made of cheap materials, located outside of the borders of Silesia in the surrounding countries and used as refuges for the suppressed Silesian Protestants. Between 1680 and 1740 the Silesian Baroque entered a period of prosperity. The palace in Sulau, built in 1680, was the first building made with all representative stylistic elements of the Baroque era. The Aldens family constructed several palace ensembles in Wulfelsdorf and Mittelwalde. Konrad Ernst Maximilian von Hochberg expanded Castle Fürstenstein. 10 years later Martin Franz enlarged Côte Zernau Palace and created one of the finest Baroque gardens in Silesia, and even some Palais Entricore Jardin emerged in Grodexberg and Brise. Entire landscape gardens, however, are rarely preserved and only known thanks to illustrations by Friedrich Bernhard Werner. After 1680 all great Silesian monasteries were altered. Of special importance here is the Abbey of Lubus with its famous representation rooms by Michael Willmann, F.A. Scheffler, Ph. Christus Bentemann, Franz Joseph Mangold. St. Elizabeth Chapel at the Cathedral of Breslau was the most significant import of Italian-inspired Baroque and the last major work carried out by Italians. 30 years later, Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach created the pendant, the Elector's Chapel, which already anticipated neoclassical ideas. The ideas of the Bohemian Baroque were spread by members of the Die Entzenhofer family and its students. The first church of this type was the Jesuit church in Liegnitz, built by Christoph and Kilian Ignaz Die Entzenhofer between 1714 and 1727. Later works can be found in Nice, Liebenthal, Lubas of Brie. They were mostly propagated by Silesian Christoph Hackner from Jauer, Martin Franz from Reval, Tallinn, and his students Karl Martin Franz and Johann Innocens Topper. A reason for the intensified construction activity in the first half of the 18th century was the implementation of the Treaty of Altrastadt, which demanded the restitution of 104 and the erection of 6 new Protestant churches, the so-called Gnadenkirchen. The abolishment of building regulation except for the erection outside of the town walls caused the heterogeneity of this group. The churches in Sagan, Freystadt and Millich were timber-framed. The churches in Hirschberg and Landeshut by Martin Franz modeled after Katharina Church in Stockholm, whereas the Protestant church in Teschen, modeled after Catholic Jesuit churches, was an exception. The biggest metropolitan ensembles were carried out in Nice, Breslau and Liegnitz. Important palaces, which combined residential and professional requirements, in Breslau were built by the family von Hatzfeld, von Spatgen, Horns and von Schrievogel, the latter being designed by Johann Lucas von Hildebrand. The biggest secular urban developments of that time were der Academy in Liegnitz, built for aristocratic children of both religious conviction, and the destroyed Episcopalian Spital in Nice. Almost no city hall was constructed during the Baroque era, and few saved the Baroque rebuildings. The annexation by Prussia marked the beginning of the end of the Baroque era in Silesia. The orientation towards the new political and artistical center in Berlin brought changes in the organization of building activities along. New artists from Prussia took the place of dying Silesian artists, for instance G. L. Schurmeister in OELs, J. M. Pohlmann in Opelna Christus, F.R. Schultz in Breslau. The newly created Building Inspection Department limited the importance of Silesian guilds and adjusted construction plans. Between the First and Second Silesian War, almost only magazines, barracks, fortification and Protestant churches were built. Towns like Coes, Brieg, Breslau, Glogau, Nice and Schweidnitz were converted to fortresses. Karlsruhe Est was the first of a number of Friedrichian urban foundations, modeled after Karlsruhe. The liberated Protestant population built large quantities of modest churches in the first years of Prussian rule, which were portrayed by Friedrich Bernhard Werner. The most prestigious project of that time was the construction of the Castle Church in Breslau, which was remodeled by Karl Gotthard Langhans and became the prototype of all later classical Protestant churches. The final say of the Catholics in Silesia was the monastery complex of the Cistercians in Grassau, the symbol of the changes and the first palace construction after the second half of the 18th century became the royal residence in Breslau, which integrated the palace of the family von Spatgen and was a mix of Friedrichian Rococo and classical components. Friedrich Wilhelm von Seydlitz, commander of Frederick's army, erected a Maison de Plaisance in Minkowski which was akin to Sanssouci, and the palace of family von Maltesen in Millich was modeled after the new palace in Potsdam.